David Horne, welcome to my channel. Thank you very much for joining me today. And yeah, it's a pleasure of having you here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic, wonderful. There's no better person than yourself probably that can tell or paint a vivid picture of yourself, what you've been up to really throughout your life and your career.
Sure.
I've seen you've been the founder of Funding Focus and Add and Multiply, dedicated to leveling the playing field for underrepresented entrepreneurs and accelerating business growth through innovative strategies. You're an author, writer, TEDx speaker. So the list goes on. Very interesting profile. And I would love to get to know you better. Maybe you can, shed some light on your experience in general.
Sure. Absolutely. So I was born in Vancouver, Canada. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. Grew up in Canada, went to school, went to university there. Always really knew that finance was where I was going to be, just kind of instinctively. I mean, when I was a little kid, aged 6 or 7 years old, when I started playing board games, I was just always the banker. My friend, if I didn't volunteer, my friends would say, "Will you be the banker?" And I was comfortable doing it. So I did that. Then I went on, and my first kind of proper job was I was a bank teller for the Royal Bank of Canada. So at the age of 18, I was, dealing with large sums of cash. And then I went on to train as a chartered accountant with PwC, qualified with them. And in the summer of 1987, my wife and I moved from Vancouver to Zurich, Switzerland. I had a job offer with PwC to join their Zurich office. So we'd been married at this stage for 4 years. So we sold off what few possessions we had and packed our clothes into 4 suitcases and got on board an airplane with one-way tickets and a 2-year employment contract. And that was 37 years ago. Ended up spending 2 years with PwC in Zurich, and then my biggest client, which was the Swiss subsidiary of an American tech business called NCR, a hardware manufacturer, and they offered me the job to become their financial controller. They were my biggest client when I was at PwC, and it was just an incredible opportunity. So I took it. So at the ripe old age of 27, I was the financial controller of a company that was turning over about $300 million US. It was pretty heady stuff. Stayed with them for 4 years in Switzerland, moved with them to London in 1993, and I've been in London ever since. And spent 2 years with NCR here. And then during that time, NCR had been acquired by AT&T, so I moved to another division of AT&T. And then I left them and went to work for the BBC for a few years, which was a fascinating experience. But I very quickly came to the realization that I was far too commercial for an organization like the Beeb. I love the Beeb. I watch their programs all the time, but wasn't quite the right place for me to be working. So I left at the end of 1999 and thinking, oh, well, I'll get a job with a .com. But fortunately, I didn't, because that whole bubble was about to burst. And then between 2000 and 2010, I was the chief financial officer of 3 very different businesses that all had one thing in common. The first one was a PR agency. The second one was a digital media and publishing company that was listed on AIM, the alternative investment market, which is the junior market on the London Stock Exchange. And the third one was an auction business also listed on AIM. And what those 3 companies had in common was that they raised capital and bought other companies. So I became a bit of an expert in fundraising and M&A, not from the perspective of being a venture capitalist or working for a corporate finance boutique, but actually in the company doing the doing. And so that was a really important kind of skill set and experience that I developed over that 10-year period. And then I left corporate world in 2010. I had what I call my midlife crisis moment. I tried to launch a wine business. Wonderful product, wonderful people, absolutely dreadful economics. The economic model of the wine trade is really, really challenging. And it's probably the best example I've ever come across of the old adage, how do you make a small fortune in the wine trade? Start with a big one. Basically, I stopped doing that actively. It's now more of a hobby business. I have a few friends who send me money and I get wine for them. I'm the biggest customer of the hobby business. So, that's all good fun. But no, so since 2012, I've been working exclusively with entrepreneurial businesses on strategies to grow their companies through implementing strong finance functions and then using a more advanced structure from what I learned in that 10-year period where it's become much more possible now in recent years for entrepreneurial businesses to raise capital and buy other companies. And I published my first book, Add Then Multiply, which tells the whole story of that, sets it out in a methodology called FACE, F-A-C-E, which stands for Fund, Acquire, Consolidate, Exit. As a result of that, I started getting invited to speak at events. And I was speaking at an event about 5 years ago now, when about fundraising. And a woman came up and asked me why so little funding went to female founders. And I said to her, I don't know, but I'll find out. And that ultimately led to the publication of my second book, Funded Female Founders, and to a discovery of an incredibly uneven playing field where female founders in the UK and Europe receive less than 2% of all venture capital funding. In the United States, it's less than 3%. And globally, it's broadly a similar story. And so, so today I run two businesses. Add Then Multiply is my for-profit consulting business, and Funding Focus is a social enterprise which is dedicated to leveling a very uneven playing field that female founders and those from non-white ethnicity face, because the reality is that the vast majority of the funding goes to white guys like you and me. And that's what I do today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this introduction. Tell me why female founders are receiving less funding. Is there a reason for that? Is there a kind of discrimination gap like with wages in corporate and other businesses?
I spent 18 months doing research before I published the second book. I think it really boils down to three key things. So number one is just inherent gender bias. It was fascinating. One of the best pieces of research I came across was a study published by Lego, the toy bricks company. And they looked at the playing habits of children from the age of 6 months up till, I think, 10 or 11 years of age. And they discovered that up until about 18 to 20 months, children didn't show any kind of preference to the types of toys that they were playing with. And then all of a sudden, around 18 to 20 months, the little boys started doing construction and playing with trucks and building things and knocking them down. And the little girls started playing with house and dolls and things like that. And what they didn't conclude, and I don't know the answer to, is was that because of inherent gender bias of their parents? And it's interesting because I have a little grandson who's 20 months old now, and I'm very interested to see how his play behaviors change, because my daughter and son-in-law are very much focused on not doing any gender bias. But the other thing that I wonder if it's true is that 100,000 years of anthropological human development, where up until, maybe the last 100 years or so, the men went out and hunted the woolly mammoths and the women stayed at the caves and tanned the hides and preserved the meat and all of that. And I don't know if it's just something that's hardwired into our brains. I don't know the answer to that one, but inherent gender bias is one of the key issues. The second one is that there aren't that many women in senior roles in the investment management industry, and so that, again, linked with the inherent gender bias, really drives a lot of that behavior. And what's really interesting, there was a study done by a woman who is now a professor at London Business School. She did her PhD studies in New York at Columbia University. And she looked at the TechCrunch New York City startup battles for a period of from 2010 until 2017. And she downloaded all of the videos into some academic analysis software that's way beyond my technical capabilities, but basically analyzed all of the pitches and all of the Q&A sessions. And she found no material difference between the way male founders and female founders presented their business. But what she found was that there was a significant bias where 67% of the questions asked of male founders were what's called a promotional question. How are you going to double your market share? Where are you going to hire your next 100 employees? And 66% of the questions asked of female founders were what's called a prevention question. How are you going to protect your customers from the competition? What if some of your employees leave and set up in competition against you? And what was really interesting was that both male and female investors showed the same kind of bias in the questioning. So you've got the inherent bias, and then you've got an additional bias within the investment industry itself. And then the final factor is that women tend to be much more conservative in their financial projections, and they tend to be much more conservative in what they're asking for and what they think they're going to achieve. And the whole venture capital model is built around, we've got to find the next unicorn. And so if a woman comes out and says, she does a financial model and it says she needs 640,832 pounds or dollars or whatever, she might ask for 650. A man will ask for 2 million and say it's going to turn into $1 billion company. And it's so there's something within the women that is jeopardizing themselves, but the bigger issue is the bias, the gender bias that's still very prevalent.
Do you think there's something we can do as a society?
Well, I think it's going to be generational change. It's not going to be done overnight. I'm currently writing a new article for someone that's looking at what's happened over the last 5 years. So in the UK, in 2019, there were 2 major studies published. One was by the British Business Bank that looked at all of the venture capital deals. And the other was a combined project between the UK government and NatWest Bank and the CEO of NatWest, or the then CEO of NatWest Bank, Alison Rose. And it's called the Alison Rose Review of Female Entrepreneurship. And both of these reports were saying, there's so much more that can be done and we need to make these changes and there's huge economic value to be achieved. And yet the reality is the level of funding has barely changed. There's data produced by PitchBook that looks at the gender mix of funding, and they've tracked data all the way back to 2008. And in the UK and Europe, only in 2008 and 2010 did it ever go above 2%. And it's currently sitting on 1.8. So over that 16-year period, it's bounced up a couple of times, but basically it's flatlined. And in the United States, it's never been more than 3%. There's a lot of talk going on. There's a lot of noise being made, but until the venture capitalists start putting money into female-founded businesses, if that doesn't happen, we need to find another model.
Okay, let's go back maybe to your childhood and teenage years. You have a quite extensive span of experiences, and we tapped into how children are kind of changing the way they play with toys, boys with constructions and girls with houses and dolls.
Yep.
I think it's in a way associated with the role models we have. So, the first role models would be our parents we look up to and try to learn from them, mirror them,
Yep.
and hopefully become like them. In your childhood, teenagers, who are your role models that shaped you as an individual or became?
Not surprisingly, my family, my parents. I mean, as I said, I'm the youngest of 4 kids, so my siblings are 4, 8, and 10 years older than me. So they were, when I was a small child. I mean, my brother and sister that are 8 and 10 years older. I mean, they were teenagers. They were just about, by the time I was 10, they were 18 and 20, and off at university and away and stuff. But no, my family played a big role. My parents always encouraged me to get involved in things. I mean, I had my first job at age 11 or 12 when I was delivering newspapers, and I did that throughout my high school years. And then, as I said, when I was at university, I was working in a bank. So I had different role models then. I remember one particular branch manager at a branch of the bank where I worked for 2 summers, and he knew that I wanted to potentially progress into a career in banking. And so he started moving me around the branch into different roles and things. But then when it came time for me to graduate, the Canadian economy was in a recession, and the bank had frozen all of their management training hires. And I remember he called me down to meet him, and basically he gave me what I didn't know then, but looking back on it was my first ever piece of career advice. Where he looked at me and he said, "Look, they've frozen the management training positions. I can't give you a job as in the management training. I'll carry on with you working as a bank teller." And then he looked at me and he said, "But David, you didn't go to university to have a career as a bank teller, did you? And that led me to then go up to the campus recruitment office, and the accounting firms were doing their annual milk rounds in a few weeks' time. And I had a few friends whose dads were chartered accountants, and I met with them and talked about it to get a feel for what it was, and applied. And I was very fortunate to get an offer from PwC.
And how would you compare your teenage years maybe to those current times? I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives, as you said, fighting for female rights, for races, for religions, for all sorts of things. The new generations have a different view. But
Yeah.
how would you compare your times to current times? Would you say there is a huge difference? And what would you say were better or worse things if you look at it from your perspective?
It's totally different today. You know, so much has changed and moved on. Things that were socially acceptable back when I was a teenager that are just not acceptable anymore. And I agree. You know, things like, you know, just approaches to, you know, sexism, racism, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was never acceptable, but it was kind of a blind eye was turned when I was younger, that is not now. And I think that's totally right. I think for the kids growing up today, one of the biggest challenges that they face is social media and cyberbullying, which is something that we never had to deal with when I was a kid growing up. I mean, we had bullying, but it was, you know, it was done face to face. You knew who your bully was. And with the social media, you often don't know who the bully is, and you don't know how to confront them, and you don't know how to deal with it. And it's a really insidious thing that I think for kids growing up today is a real challenge, and for parents to help their kids through that.
Looking at that perspective, because you tapped into social media and cyberbullying, now we're dealing with different kind of challenges. Our self-esteem is different. We're not confident anymore. And sometimes we don't really know how to deal with challenges in general on a daily basis. Compared with you times when you were younger, how did you deal with challenges when you were facing them, and what did you do to overcome them? Do you have any tips for younger people maybe to deal with challenges?
I mean, I think, you know, and I don't wish to sound whingy about this, but I think we had a lot more freedom to do and explore when we were kids. I mean, you know, it wasn't uncommon for me from the age of maybe 8 or 9 to jump on my bicycle and go over to a friend's house, and then we would go out and we'd go down to the beach or go to a park or go into town and watch a film. And, you know, my parents knew I was out with my friend Chris or my friend Martin or my friend Doug or whomever, and they knew that I'd be home for dinner. But apart from that, they didn't really know where I was and what I was doing. And we were we had a lot more freedom. I mean, today, I think for a lot of kids, it's a much more controlled environment. I think parents drive the kids more places in the cars than they used to. You know, I guess it's also a factor of where you grow up. I mean, the city where I grew up, so I was born in Vancouver, and then I grew up in a smaller city called Victoria, population of about, I don't know, 250,000 then. I think it's about 400,000 today. Whereas I now live in London, which is a city with 8 million people. So it is kind of you're not comparing apples and apples. It's an apples and oranges type of thing. But yeah, I think we had a lot more freedom back then to just go out and explore and roam and do that kind of stuff than the kids of today have.
I'm talking about youth again, and comparing those times. Is there a moment from your childhood, the teenage years, you could go back in time and relive it? And if yes, what would that be? Any a positive or negative?
Oh yeah, no, a positive one. So it's kind of linked to two, but it would be my second trip to Europe when I was 15 years old. So my first trip to Europe, I was 12, and we flew into London, and I fell in love with London. I've been in love with London ever since, and I'm delighted to call it home now. But we traveled around France, Switzerland, Germany, Holland, and I remember being fascinated but frustrated. Fascinated because everything was different. The food was different. The language was different. The architecture was different. The cars were different. The fashion was different. But frustrated because I couldn't communicate. And then I went back to Canada and went into high school. And in Canada, in high school, in the English part, you start learning French. And so I was learning French, and a lot of my friends were kind of complaining, "Oh God, we're going to learn French." Blah, blah. And I was thinking, no, it's great because I've been to Paris, I've seen the Eiffel Tower, I've done these things, and it had real meaning for me. And then in my second year of high school, I started to learn German as well. I had the ability to learn another language, and the choice was German or Spanish. And I chose German because I'd been to Germany. I hadn't been to Spain. And then when I was 15, my family came back to Europe. That just totally opened my eyes. And I remember deciding at the age of 15, I can still picture it. We were flying from London to Holland, and we were coming in to land. And there's beautiful green fields around Schiphol Airport, all the farmlands and stuff. And I just remember thinking, one day I'm going to live in Europe. And 10 years later, my wife and I moved to Switzerland, and we've never looked back. So yeah, to relive that moment, when that European trip when I was 15 years old, it was a life-changing event.
We talked a fair bit about business in general and your career. The younger people today have a different perspective of how to pursue the career or profession. Mostly people want to work, let's put it that way, less. We want more rewards for it, more flexibility, more freedom, so we can juggle our hobbies, our private life, our entrepreneurship minds, and all these things. So younger people look at work completely different than when I was younger, or other generations. We used to have a job for 10, 20 years, have a stable job. One job perfectly would be fine, so you could be secure in life. But what career advice would you give to younger people, or when choosing a profession, maybe in your field or any other field in general? Because the school system, in my opinion, for example, is not preparing us really well for the world. We don't know how to manage our finances, how to deal with challenges, how to interact with people, maybe how to prep for an interview, how to write our resume. Now everything is automated. We got artificial intelligence. So we interact less with human beings. But what would your call be when someone chooses a career, passion, or profession and wants to go into the kind of direction? And
do what you love, do what excites you, do what you enjoy, do what's creating value for the world. There's a wonderful Japanese concept called ikigai, which is if you can find what you love to do, what the world needs, what you can make a living doing, and there's one other that I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you can find that sweet spot of those four things, you will be satisfied and have a fulfilling professional life. I think a lot of the changes of the younger generation, sort of the Gen Zs and the millennials, it's admirable that they're looking at more of a work-life balance. Let's see how that all pans out over time. I don't know, because I know that to succeed in a career or in your own business involves an awful lot of hard work. And it's interesting to look at how that pans out. And I know, my kids are in their early 30s now, and they and their friends, they're much more focused on that balance, and they're perhaps a little less focused on kind of climbing the greasy pole, if you will. I can't say if it's right or it's wrong. It's just very, very different to how it was when I was growing up. You went out, you got your career. I've changed roles many more times than in previous generations. When I was growing up, it was already the kind of concept of, you got a job and stayed with the same company for 40 years and retired was already on its way out. I've probably had jobs at 10 or 12 different companies, and then for the last 14 years, I've run my own business. So it's quite different. But I think if they can make it work, I think one of the other key changes, and I see this as broadly a good thing. When I was growing up, it was much more, for a couple, the man went out and did the work, and the woman stayed at home and looked after the house and looked after the kids. And these days, it's a much more balanced approach. I have two daughters, and they're both in long-term relationships. My daughters and their partners both work, and one of them is raising kids, the other one not yet, but hopefully soon. But there's a much better sharing of responsibilities than I think there was when I was younger. So I think from that perspective, I think that's a good thing.
But don't you think as well, when people are in relationships, they both going to work maybe and start a family much later because times are much harder and challenging than they used to be, because back in the days, from the conversations I had, or just generally seeing the landscape, you could afford a lot of things with one salary. You could go buy a house, you could feed your family, you could potentially buy a car. I mean, not everyone, but mostly people
Yeah.
could save money and do these things. Today, when someone finishes a degree or starts a job, I live in London, and it's almost impossible to be able to
Yeah.
rent your own flat, pay your bills, phone, buy some food, clothes, and then still save some money up. I mean, it's
Yeah.
quite challenging. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
this is
It
another
is.
reason why couples are going and work, and then they decide to have a family at a much later time, because it's
Yes.
not possible to sustain yourself.
Yes, that's true. That's definitely true. I think that's just one of those societal shifts. Yeah, especially, I mean, London's a very expensive city. So one of my daughters lives in London. My other daughter lives on the Isle of Wight. They both bought properties at more or less the same time. My daughter in London has a 2-bed flat with a garden, and my daughter on the Isle of Wight has a 5-bed Victorian semi-detached house. They paid the same amount of money. And I think, one of the issues that we saw in recent times as a result of the pandemic was a lot of people were moving out of London. A lot of people were saying, well, I don't have to be at my office in London. I can work remotely. And I think that's led to, some spread and some evening out of things. But yeah, London's a very expensive city. So is Vancouver, where I grew up. So yeah.
And besides the things we've tapped into, like social media, cyberbullying, and challenging economical times, maybe, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing younger generations today? And what do you think how they can overcome them in general? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond the kind of the cost of living kinds of things that we've already touched on, I think that our education system needs a significant overhaul, because as you were mentioning, a lot of basic life skills aren't being taught. I have one friend and mentor who's very outspoken about this, and his view is that our education system right now was designed 100 years ago for the Industrial Revolution, when we wanted to teach people how to be good factory workers. Most people aren't factory workers anymore, and the education system hasn't caught up with them. So I think things like practical skills, apprenticeships, those kinds of things, I think are really, really important to give people the skills that they can develop and learn. And I mean, when I was growing up, it was like, you will go to university. It's really important to get a degree, even though my parents' generation, many of them didn't go to university. In my generation, it was like, you will go to university. But, university was free or significantly subsidized. And today, for someone growing up in the UK, if they're going to university, they're coming out with significant student debt, and they don't, they're not taught about how debt works, so they don't understand that. And I think a lot of that lack of financial skills training is really harming people, and they're going out and they buy stuff, and then they get offered a store card or a credit card, and then they get in deeper into debt. And they don't realize, they think, oh, this is great. Well, I can buy this on my card, and then, I can pay it off over time. But then all of a sudden they realize that, the monthly payments on their credit card are absolutely crippling them, on top of the other things. So I think our education system needs a significant overhaul to provide young people with a lot of the basic skills that they need to get on in the world today. And I think basic financial skills is absolutely a core part of that.
So working in finance and being an expert in that field as well, what one tip would you give the younger generation about finance? Do you think they should really acquire and manifest it to be financially stable? Do you have one short tip maybe?
Learn about how finance works, learn about what money is, learn about what credit is. And if you don't get taught that in school, there are books that are out there that you can go to in your library, that will help you, rather than blindly accepting what people in the financial services industry tell you, and, oh, here, have a credit card and all of that. Understand what it's all about. Understand how it works. understand that, credit cards are great if you pay them off, but if you don't pay them off, they're a very, very expensive source of debt. You can get into really crippling situations where there are tragic stories of people who've gotten, young people who've gotten into terrible debt, and then they've gone and killed themselves because they don't know how to deal with it. And that's just absolutely tragic. And I think, just trying to pick up some basic knowledge, ask their parents about it. And maybe their parents aren't very good. Well, then go to the library and find some books or go online. There's so much free stuff available online now. You can learn about the basics of finance. Just, go onto YouTube or listen to podcasts. There's a whole bunch of things that they can do and that are freely accessible.
Let's talk about habits. Do you have a positive habit that you developed throughout your life that followed you and you could share with others?
Oh, wow. Yeah, habits come and go. I think one of the things that I've developed, especially over the last maybe 10 years, is to have a positive mindset and to really look at what's happening in your life. And there was a wonderful quote from Henry Ford, the US industrialist who created Ford motor cars, more than 100 years ago. And he said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So if you're going out and you think, oh, well, I can't do that, then your brain is going to manifest things to happen to make it not possible. But if you go to think, yeah, yes, it's going to be hard work, but I can do this. Yes, yes, there are going to be challenges, but if I work hard, I can achieve, I can break through them. I can learn these new skills. Yes, I can do this. Yes, this is possible. And it's also an issue with happiness. I think one of the key things in life is, we all have the power to be happy if we choose to be happy. And one of my favorite stories around that came from Steve Wozniak, who was the co-founder of Apple. He was the tech genius behind Steve Jobs' marketing genius. And I saw Steve Wozniak speak about 10 years ago, and he said, and bear in mind, he's a multiple billionaire. He said, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much money you have or how many people worked for you or how big your house was or what kind of car you drove. At the end of the day, when it's all over and done with, what counts is how happy were you? And then he said, and I love this bit, he said, being a bit of a tech geek, I came up with a formula for happiness. H equals S minus F. Happiness equals smiles minus frowns. And the greatest thing he said was, no matter what's going on in your life, you get to choose if you smile or frown. So when something good happens, you're going to smile. But when something bad happens, instead of going into a deep, dark place and grumbling about it and moaning about it for days and days, accept that it's happened, but figure out what you can learn from it that can make your life better. And, is it really that big of a deal? I mean, take road rage. Okay, so someone cut you off. Is it really that big of a deal? Or can you just kind of let it go and move on? And I think the ability to let go of those negative emotions and concentrate on the positive things. We all have the ability inside our brains to do that. Sometimes we don't always realize that, but we all have the ability inside our minds to do that. And I think that more than anything would lead to a happier and more equitable world.
Thank you for sharing. What about relationships, whether these would be professional, family, friends, or romantic partners? What lesson have you learned throughout your life about them?
Well, I was incredibly lucky. I met my wife when we were 17. We've been married for 41 years. Yeah, I'm blessed in that regard. I know lots of people who haven't had those kinds of relationships. But I think the key thing for me is, as with anything, a relationship takes work. You don't just sort of get married and then not really do anything. That's what leads to unhappiness and broken marriages. You need to keep building relationships. You need to keep working on it. I always say to people, consider the word love to be a verb rather than a noun. So it requires work. It requires commitment. It requires flexibility. But if you've got two people who are committed to a long-term relationship, it's a wonderful thing. And I'm so grateful that I met my wife when I was 17 years old.
Now it's much harder. I mean, relationships or marriages don't last as long as they used to.
Yep.
And I think it's a shift in generations. Maybe it's different. Maybe people got married much more earlier than they used to now, because as we discussed it earlier, it's you have to sustain yourself, so you have to work
Yep.
harder.
Yep.
But I think it also comes out from how you've been brought up and raised in your family, and when you have a role model to look up into and maybe mirror them and
Yes.
kind of try to achieve the similar thing.
Yes. No, that's true. I mean, I think, people who are entering relationships today have the possibility of, which was much less common when I was growing up, and positively frowned upon when my parents were growing up, was actually living together before you get married. I think that's an excellent thing. Living together with someone, going to bed together, waking up in the morning, being in the same house, eating all your meals together. It really allows you to test out, is this person right for me, and am I right for them? I mean, as I said, in my parents' generation, it was positively frowned upon. In when I was growing up, it was sort of they're living together before they're married, isn't that unusual? But now it's totally normal, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, because once you make the commitment of marriage, unwinding it is messy and expensive and gets lawyers involved and lots of emotions and all that stuff. And I've observed friends go through breakups, and some of them went smoothly and some of them didn't, and the ones that didn't got very, very messy and very, very unpleasant.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. What do you think is the key to a successful and fulfilling life? This could be your own perspective, but it could be in general, giving advice to younger people.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
sharing
think
your own experience.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's twofold. It's professional and it's personal. On the personal side, definitely having a long-term relationship with someone that you love and that you can learn from, and that who learns from you. And I look at the relationship that my wife and I have evolved, and I have learned so much from her, and she's learned one or two things from me. I mean, I'm a much nicer human being because of my wife. She's my wife is an empath. She senses how other people feel, and I never had that skill, and I learned so much about self-awareness and about not trying to put myself first. Bear in mind, again, I was the youngest of four kids who were a lot older than me. So when I was growing up, if I wanted to be heard, I just had to shout loudly. Most kids, whatever the environment is they're growing up with, they think that's normal behavior. I'm so grateful to my wife for learning that skill, and I taught her to be much more adventurous. I mean, as I said, we moved to Switzerland in 1987. We were 25 years old. I was really excited about it, and for her it was a big scary thing, but she came along with me, and she says, one of the best things she learned from me was not to be afraid to take those adventures, not to be afraid to go out of your comfort zone. So I think, on the personal side, it's finding people that you can build a relationship with where it's mutually beneficial. And then on the professional side, again, it comes back to that whole ikigai thing. Find something that you love doing. As I said, I've worked most of my career in financial roles. I was the CFO of companies listed on the stock exchange. I saw lots of people working in the city in big banking jobs and insurance jobs and things like that. And they were pulling down a lot of money, and they hated their job every single day. They hated it, but they felt like they were stuck. And to me, that just sounds horrible. That's like being in a cage. It might be a golden cage, but it's still a cage. And I would far rather have less money, but be happy doing what I do every day than being, rolling in the dough and hating my work every day. I couldn't do that. When I left my business and started out on my own, it was scary. And it took a long time before I was making the kind of money I was making before, but it was a worthwhile thing to do because my happiness levels changed significantly.
But unfortunately, today we see the shift through social media channels, or in general, the internet, that a lot of people trying to sell you the blue pill, as you would call it, with becoming successful, a millionaire overnight. And I had many conversations in the past with different people. And as you said in this interview as well, it's very, very demanding, and it requires a lot of commitment, hard work, and dedication to become successful or to start your own business, be strong-minded as well at the same time. But I think because the new generations want to have this work-life balance, they're trying to seek this kind of
Yeah,
success story where they can become millionaires overnight. And unfortunately,
yeah,
it doesn't work this way.
it
Then
does
it's nothing
not.
bad to shoot for the stars, become, successful, but it also means you have to be, I think you have to have the right skill sets and
And sometimes
attitude,
you just
because
need
a lot
luck.
of people are not kind of positive. We
Yep.
don't look
And
at, connecting with each other. We trying to distance ourselves from each other, don't see common things. We see differences. We don't like each other. There's more hate around, and everyone is kind of selfish and trying to find the success to reach the skies in a way.
yep, it's really difficult. I mean, take take the overnight millionaire. The reality is most of those people who proclaim to be overnight millionaires, look at their backstory. How many years did they slog it out before all of a sudden they found the right combination? And then, yes, it took off, but they put in the hard yards. It's very, very, very unusual to find a case of someone who, started their first business and struck it rich and, made a fortune overnight. The reality of that is that was just an extreme case of luck. In most cases, they've worked hard and they've had to pivot and change and adapt and adopt and try new things, and then all of a sudden they find something and then off it goes. It's kind of like, one of the other things that a lot of people talk about today is passive income. But passive income doesn't just happen. Passive income happens because you've built up assets that can do stuff without you having to be involved. So, you might have a portfolio of properties. Well, you had to work hard to get the money to build up the portfolio of properties, and then you had to manage those properties, and you had to do all that kind of work. And I think a lot of people don't look at what happened before these things came to light. They just thought, oh, hey, wouldn't it be lovely to have passive income? Well, sure it would, but for 99.9% of the population, who aren't born in a very fortunate situation where they've had wealth given to them or something like that, they've had to work hard to build it. In the context of social media, you can't believe everything you see on Instagram.
Unfortunately, this is the only source we have these days. So compared to all the times when you wanted to source a piece of information, you most likely would go to the library or speak to people who are an expert in that field, and then you would educate yourself and research. Today, we are presented with a ton of information that are produced by other human beings who are not necessarily experts in these fields. We have also artificial intelligence who is trained by not only the programmers, who we don't know who they really are and what intentions they have, but also fed information from people who have those questions.
Yep.
And then we present it with those things, and we don't
Yep.
have the sources or the time to question what is in front of us. That's why when we see numerous times pieces of information, we think, okay, that's true. And the reality is that majority, 3/4 or more of those informations that lay in front of us are not reliable or not truthful, but we still take them
Exactly.
on because we've seen them in front of us, and it's
Yep.
it's a shame, unfortunately,
Yep,
because
it
now
is. I think
artificial intelligence is taking away our brain and the thought process. We start to think less, and we believe just what is in front of us.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah. We will
yeah.
have to learn and wait and see how things
Go
change.
back to the library. The libraries are still there. You can still go to them.
All right. I've got two last questions for you.
Okay.
One thing is about the books. You've talked about the books at the beginning of the interview you've written, but are there any books, whether these would be yours or any other books you've read in your life, that you would say are worthwhile reading and you would recommend to others? Any particular that's tapping you on?
Very much. So there's a wonderful book. It's a very short book, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was a Jewish prisoner of war during the Nazi times, and he came to a realization, and the way he puts it in the book is, I'll paraphrase it, I can't do the exact quote, but between a stimulus and a response, there is a space and a time where we are free to choose what the response will be. And what Frankl discovered was during his times in the concentration camps, and horrible things were being done to him, he still maintained the freedom to decide how he responded to what was being done. And that realization gave him such mental strength. And, you know, even the guards in the camps used to say that he was the freest man in the camp. So it's a very short book, but it's really, really good. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Then another book that I really like, that really helped me on my journey, was by a guy called Mike Dooley, and it's called Infinite Possibilities. And I'll just let the title of that sit because it's pretty clear. Infinite Possibilities. And the last one is a book written by a very good friend and mentor of mine. His name's Daniel Priestley, and it's called Entrepreneur Revolution. And if anybody who's listening is interested in starting a new business, I highly, highly recommend that they read Entrepreneur Revolution. So that's 3. I could give you dozens more, but that's 3.
I think that would suffice. But thank you very much for
as you can see from behind me, I read a lot of books.
Yeah, that's great. No, but thank you very much for sharing those.
My pleasure.
From the stories and everything you've shared in this interview, I always ask this question at the end, but it's very important. Is there any final words of wisdom, apart from what you've said already, that you would want to pass on to the younger generation? Equip them with anything you think could be valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 61 years old now. I've got kids, I've got grandchildren. My perspective on life has changed so much over the years. But one of the key things I think is, for all of us, we're born, we grow up, we get old, and we die. Some die younger than others. Some die tragically young. But for the vast majority of us, we're born, we grow up, we get old, and we die. And I think if we could all just accept that we're born, we grow up, we get old, and we die, and not worry about it, but accept it and accept the natural changes that happen. I used to have black hair. Now I've got a big white streak in the middle of it. I mean, if this had been 20 years ago, someone might have said, "Oh, you must have paid a fortune to get that." But it just happened naturally. But yeah, no, I think let just accept life for what it is and have the confidence, again, coming back to what I said really early on, have the confidence to have a positive mindset and take the view that if you really set your mind to do something, you can achieve it in the world.
Wonderful, David. Thank you very much for sharing this
My
piece
pleasure.
of wisdom, but also the entire stories. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here today, and I'm very grateful for you have taken the time to speak to me today and sharing so many great stories.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.